If I'm talking about, academic misconduct, or if I'm talking about value in community and the value in cultivating an affinity for the institution, students will hear me say that. And although I can say it in a very authentic way, students will interpret that as, well, I mean, you're the dean of students. Like, that's what you're supposed to say.
Welcome to In Your Element, a podcast on the Enrollify podcast network, brought to you by Element 451, an advanced student engagement CRM providing higher ed institutions with a competitive advantage from recruitment to enrollment and beyond. On each show, we ask 5 questions about current challenges, exciting opportunities, and what's next in higher education. I'm your co-host, Erin Newton, and along with Ardis Kadiu, we welcome University of Oregon Dean of Students, Marcus Langford. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have been hot topics on campuses and throughout the world in recent years. So how have higher ed institutions evolved to make sure DEI is a priority, both in enrollment and throughout the education process? That's what we'll be diving into today. For Marcus, his higher education path started in a pretty unusual way, with him as a Miami of Ohio freshman thinking of dropping out or transferring.
And I tell folks all the time that I went into that with nefarious purposes. So my goal, in my 18-year-old mind was to be an orientation leader. And I was going to be the orientation leader, that kind of kept it real. Let everybody know that, this place was okay, but it wasn't like the greatest. And so as you can imagine what happened, I applied, was miraculously accepted, and had a fantastic experience. I got connected to that institution in a way that I previously had not been connected. Got connected to the faculty, got connected to staff, got connected to other students, and it radically shifted my perspective and experience.
Marcus stayed at Miami even through graduate school. He then went on to roles at Oregon State University, Rhodes College, University of Cincinnati, and ultimately the University of Oregon, where he was named Dean of Students in July of 2021. To start our conversation, we asked Marcus how COVID has impacted enrollment.
I think, one, it has forced us to think outside of the box. It's forced us to think bigger. It's forced us to think more broadly, and it's forced us to move beyond, these traditional notions of we've always done it this way, or getting students involved on campus always or has to look like X, Y, or Z. And so we're trying to engage students, but what does that really mean? Are we trying to help students, kind of cultivate connections? Are we trying to help students cultivate relationships? Are we trying to help students develop an affinity for or to, this institution or place? And so, from my perspective, again, the pandemic has forced us to really think about and articulate what we mean when we say student engagement. It's not always about, this notion of, kind of getting students together and, showing a movie, or it's not always about getting students together and giving, free pizza or giving a free t-shirt. Again, it's really forced us to think about what it is that we're trying to do. And then once we zero in on that, think about ways in which we can do that that we historically haven't done. And so I would also say that, the pandemic has really, encouraged us to think about the necessity of leveraging digital platforms, in terms of engaging students. And that's something that I think students have, kind of been aware of and attuned to. But I would say I don't know if we as faculty and staff have been as invested in that in the way that we probably should have or could have. And so I think the pandemic has somewhat accelerated that as well.
Marcus, one of the things that we try to define is this word engagement. And when it comes to student engagement, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. What does it mean to you, and what does it mean to Oregon when you talk about student engagement?
I'm going to go with Oregon first. I would say that I think that's a conversation, that we're still having in, kind of pockets of the institution. I don't know if I am at a place right now where I can say that, engagement at the University of Oregon means X, Y, and Z. I think elements of engagement is around helping students develop and have an affinity for the institution. I think engagement includes helping students have a sense of belonging. I think engagement also includes opportunities where students can make connections to others. So those are, from my perspective, I think I would say three of the most critical pieces of engagement.
So it's all about building relationships or strengthening those relationships.
Mhm.
How do you foster diversity, equity, and inclusion when there's so much polarization in the world and in higher ed?
To be honest, I think that's something that we as institutions are still wrestling with. I think one of the things that I would say is I think there is value in being exposed to multiple perspectives. And so I think one of the ways in which, we support the advancement of diversity, equity, and inclusion is to continue to think about, the voices and the experiences that we are elevating and investing. And so, when we think about, speakers, and when we think about experiences that we bring to campus, and when we think about opportunities, ensuring that we are kind of widening the canon, if you will. And so, if I can lean on my English background for a little bit, oftentimes when we think about issues related to engagement, or when we think about ways to help students be involved or engaged, in my experience, we typically do that from a very limited perspective. And so, research has shown us that oftentimes when institutions define what engagement looks like or what engagement means, I'll be pretty transparent that we do that from the perspective of what's good and what white male students typically do. And so I think part of the way of one, helping more students be engaged, but then also enhancing issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion is to expand, our canon a little bit. So let's expand what engagement means and looks like for different groups of students. And one of the ways we can do that, again, is to kind of expand what our conceptualizations of engagement and diversity, equity, and inclusion is. And so, that's one of the ways in which that I would say that we expand diversity, equity, inclusion is we try to add different experiences and different perspectives to some of the things that we're doing and some of the things that we're offering on campus.
A lot of times we talk about DEI as being something that we need to include in everything that we do. But we all know that unless there is some guardrails that we put in place or there's initiatives that we put in place, it's very hard to change culture, to change outcomes. So a lot of institutions that we see, they have included DEI officers as part of their engagement or student affairs as part of their. So I guess that's where that question was coming about. Is there a trend in how DEI is included and embedded as part of your day to day or as part of your business of student affairs? Or maybe it was
Yeah,
always there.
what I would say is I think moving forward, we have been and we do need to be more intentional about expanding access to our programs and expanding the scale and scope of our programs. And so, in terms of integrating DEI into our work, conduct and community standards, for example, one of the things that we've been doing lately is we've started to walk down this road of looking at, let's be honest, or let's look at why there is a disproportionate impact or disproportionate involvement of students of color in our conduct process. And so what is it about our procedures, or what is it about our interpretation, or what is it about our application of the conduct code that gets us to a place where students of color are being more adversely impacted by our conduct processes. Another example is within our crisis intervention work. And so we have a group of folks who work with students who are in crisis. And so one of the things that we know is that all students experience some form of crisis at some point in their experience. But when we look at statistics, we're finding that historically our students from underrepresented and historically marginalized identities typically avail themselves to our crisis support services at a smaller rate. Why is that? So when we know that all students experience crisis at some point, what is it about the overall design and or implementation of our services that make them potentially less attractive to students from historically marginalized identities that may need our support? And so one of the things that we are looking forward to doing as we go into this year is we're kind of creating programs where we are going to put crisis intervention staff at places across campus where students from those populations are. So we are going to move to a model where our crisis staff are now going to spend time at the Black Cultural Center. We're going to move to a model where some of our crisis staff are going to spend time at the Multicultural Center. We're going to move forward with ensuring that our crisis staff have time to work with and have some specific conversations with our coordinator of multicultural student success and engagement and our coordinator of LGBT education and support. So those folks can inform the work that our crisis staff are doing in an effort, again, to kind of expand, the range of their services. So I think those are just two ways that I would point to some of the work that we
Right.
in the Dean of Students Office at the University of Oregon are really trying to lean into, conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we can be better and more intentional about bringing that work into what we're doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's really relevant as we see it every day on the admission side, as those underrepresented populations are the ones who need more hand-holding and
Mhm.
need a little bit more, like they tend to fall off the funnel or the process a lot faster than somebody who has a little bit more support. So that additional support and finding them. And with the pandemic, what's happening also is that support system on the high school level with the counselors and essentially being there in person, it's no longer there. So it's like, how do you
Mhm.
get to them? How do you, if they're not in physically in school, how do you get to those communities and how do you kind of push them along?
It goes back to the engagement piece too, where maybe
Exactly.
back in the day would be like, okay, we're going to have an initiative and this is what we're doing. But now it's okay, now let's actually go and also involving more data and actually what's going on rather than presuming why aren't these students availing of these resources and then actually having a plan to do something and enacting that plan.
I think one of the things that I would say we need to be better about within higher ed is really integrating student voice and student perspective in what it is that we are trying to do. I've come to the realization that my understanding and conception of what students want, need, and are looking for is oftentimes very different than students' own conceptualizations of what they want, what they need, and what they are looking for. And so, as a result of that, I feel that we as institutions of higher education really need to be more mindful and intentional about identifying and cultivating and integrating student voice and perspective into what it is that we're trying to do. I know one of the questions was around comments that I've made in the past about emails and students not reading emails. It's not necessarily that students don't read emails. I think it's two things that are connected to that. One is, I would say, that we aren't finding ways to make what we're sending to students relevant to them. And if something is delivered in a way they can't ascertain its relevance quickly, it just gets pushed to the wayside. And then kind of the second thing connected, to my email rant is we send oftentimes things that are entirely too text heavy. And I think sometimes there is a reluctance to figure out how to scale some of that stuff down. Because again, in my mind, in our mind, it's, well, this is all important information and we need to make sure, that we get this out to students. And I get that and I understand that. But when these students get these text dense and these text heavy emails, like, they just aren't going to pay attention to it. And so again, how can we figure out ways to get this information to students in ways that's attractive, appealing, and relevant to them? And part of that, again, I go back to, we have to find ways to get students, to kind of help us think about what that can and should look like.
Right student, right message, right time.
Mhm. That's it. That's the trifecta. And I think if you can get, those things in alignment, that is, what will kind of get us from one place to another, in terms of, students either not knowing or not responding to what it is that we're trying to get them to know or to respond to.
And the walls of, text in the emails, it reminds me of, the walls of text on websites and how it's just that immediate blocker, that
Mhm,
engagement or just communicating is just
mhm.
all that much more difficult. People just tune out, and being
Yeah.
aware of that.
Yeah. So, Marcus, what are you doing on your campus right now at Oregon to get in front of these students? So we talked about the DEI, some of the DEI initiatives that you're doing,
Mhm.
but what's your favorite engagement channel with your students?
So we have I can't remember how often it goes out, but there's a message that goes out to students, but they've reframed it as quick quacks. And so instead of, an email with all of, kind of the text heavy things, it's been reformatted to where it's almost kind of like the Twitter feed, type of things. And so, they've refocused and, it's the headline and it's a couple of, salient points. And, if you're interested, click on it and that takes you to something else where it gives you a little bit more detail. And my understanding, based on conversation that I've had with some of our communications folks, is our click rates and our open rates have been off the roof. I think another thing I'm pretty excited about, so I'll go back to conduct again. And so students really don't get jazzed about thinking about the conduct code and academic dishonesty and whatnot. And so I've recently been in a conversation with some of our conduct staff, and they are in the process of hiring. They hire a student to make, kind of like TikToks and videos about some of these relevant things like the academic misconduct policy and whatnot. Yes, I can go on Twitter and I can have a TikTok and I can be on Instagram. But I would say the way in which I communicate, if I was trying to talk about academic dishonesty, it just wouldn't hit the same, as if we again hire a student to do that. So I think those are some of the approaches that we're trying to figure out, how to do in a really meaningful and authentic way here at UO as well.
It kind of reminds me of, Marcus, when you were talking about your approach
Mhm,
when you were going to be working at admissions as a student,
mhm,
that it would be like the real
mhm, mhm, mhm.
authentic that just carries through, that was, what
Yeah.
students want. There's some fundamentals, I think, of what people relate to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say authenticity is really important. I consider myself a very, authentic person. But I think authenticity and credibility, those are things that we need to think about whenever we're figuring out, how to put messages in front of students. We all know, well, I say we all know, unfortunately, I don't think it's a known quantity, but I would say in my experience, students see other students as credible, as more credible. And so again, if I'm talking about academic misconduct, or if I'm talking about value in community and the value in cultivating an affinity for the institution, students will hear me say that. And although I can say it in a very authentic way, students will interpret that as, well, I mean, you're the dean of students. Like, that's what you're supposed to say. So while my credibility level may have been like a two, if another student says the same thing, the credibility, kind of factor or level, and I'm somewhat making these numbers up, but like the credibility factor when another student says the exact same thing, it goes up to like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, as opposed to like a 2 out of 10 when I say it again, because as the dean of students, I'm delivering the company line. And so I think those are things that we need to be mindful of as institutions, again, when we think about, what are these messages, and how are they being delivered, I go back to, can we figure out ways to integrate, kind of student voice and student perspective and even student presence in some of the things that we're trying to communicate.
How do you ensure that students reach their goals and kind of the institution's goals?
I think part of persistence is about helping students cultivate a sense of belonging, and so students are more likely to persist when they feel like they belong at our institutions. And so for me, persistence is really connected to helping students find ways to develop and have a sense of belonging. Like, yeah, we can help students fit in, and we can help students connect. But for me, this notion of sense of belonging, that's a little deeper. And so for me, I think persistence is connected to being intentional about cultivating ways for students to develop and really feel and experience a sense of belonging. And so, some of that will be around cultivating relationships with other students. Some of that will be around helping them develop a connection to, the academic program or what it is that they're doing. And so I think figuring out, what are some of the many ways that we can help students cultivate a sense of belonging. In my experience, if you're able to do that, that will have an absolute impact on persistence. Again, because students will want to come back and students will want to be here if they feel like they belong.
How do you see mental health playing a role in that belonging currently, given that we've all gone remote? And how does that translate from being on campus, being in that stadium, everybody rooting, go Ducks, right? And then now you go online. How does that transfer?
So one of the things that we've been talking about, is this notion of an ethic of care. I would say it's become a little more common for us to kind of operate with grace, and give folks a benefit of the doubt. Kind of artists, getting back to your point around mental health, there's been kind of this increased focus on recognizing, that like we all are in this incredibly challenging and difficult place, and that we all have, a lot going on and weighing on our minds. And so moving forward, part of the conversations that I've had is kind of encouraging people to be mindful of how we can continue to kind of operate within this ethic of care, even as, we kind of come back to campus. And so let's be attuned to the fact that coming back to campus is going to mean different things for different folks. And so recognizing, that it'll be on a spectrum. So some folks are going to be, really, really excited and kind of are going to be raring to go. But there are also folks who are going to be rightfully so, a little apprehensive. And, it's going to take some time for them to kind of get back in the rhythm of being in, kind of all these one-on-one meetings and kind of constantly being in and out, of spaces and kind of interacting with all of these different faces. And so part of, I think, at least for us at Your Vote is, again, we've been having conversations of how can we continue to operate within this ethic of care, recognizing that folks are still going to be dealing with a number of issues as we try to kind of establish and figure out what our new normal is going to be.
That was Marcus Langford, Dean of Students at the University of Oregon, which you can find at uoregon.edu. And follow Marcus on Twitter, where he's at Marcus R. Langford. Thank you for listening to In Your Element, brought to you by Element 451 and part of the Enrollify podcast network. You can find more about the Element 451 Student Engagement CRM at element451.com. And if you like what you heard, please give us a rating and review, and follow along on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Erin Newton, and we'll see you next time on In Your Element.